As I was introduced, my paper is entitled The Lovecraft Problem. Thank you all for being here. Looking forward to it, and looking forward to hearing your questions after the fact. I tend to go fast, so if I say something that's unclear or that's confusing, if it's cool with the moderators, it's cool with me if you just interrupt and ask me for clarification. So schedule for this presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of background or origin story of how this came to be, the problem that I'm going to try to solve. H.P. Lovecraft, I'll talk about him as our sort of criterion for solving the problem. Then I'll present two different solutions from two different thinkers. First, from Camus, his concept of metaphysical rebellion, and second, from Walsh, from his essay, Priority of the Person, that we read for this fellowship. So a little bit of background. I've been Jewish my whole life, but I've had a complicated relationship with my faith. I've had lots of ups and downs. And when I came to the Zephyr Fellowship, I was in the middle of the worst materialist crisis of my life. Every night I found myself thinking, what if this is all there is? What if I'm just pure matter and I'm nothing more than that? It was no fun at all. Luckily, we were presented with Karl Rahner. As soon as we had this reading, I knew that there was something important here that was going to make a difference in my life. But unfortunately, I'm brand new to metaphysics. I've never studied it formally before, and as I read everything on the page, I really had no idea what was going on. I was very, very confused. Lucky for us, this fellowship also has lectures, and Reverend Stephen Fields gave me one of the best lectures I've ever encountered by describing Rahner in what I thought was a really beautiful, elegant, and applicable to my life way. In his description, he described Rahner as thinking of humans as a sort of living paradox. We are these beings capable of transcendent knowledge, of transcendent thought, of pursuing this field that we call metaphysics, but we're physically embodied in the world. We're come into this world as sort of a blank slate, and all of the information we gain, all the data that we have for our thoughts comes from our physical senses and comes in from the physical world around us. So how do we get from this place of the physical world to higher levels of knowledge, to higher levels of understanding about the reality that we all live in? Rahner argues that we sort of have to climb a ladder of experiencing sort of different levels of reality in order to reach the divine, in order to reach transcendency. And the sort of first step on this ladder, as Reverend Fields explained it, was physics as sort of universal principles. Gravity, the law of displacement that Archimedes discovered. When you put something in water, it displaces that amount of water. These are things that are real, but they're not tangible. They're not physical things that we can hold and see and feel. They are the rules that undergird our reality, but are no less real as a result. So the process of sort of transcendent knowledge, in Rahner's view, at least as it was presented in this lecture, is the process of trying to discover what is the single unifying universal principle of these other universal principles. What is the next step on that ladder once we get past the universal principles that undergird our physical material reality? And this is the way that we can start as material beings embodied in the world and end as beings capable of transcendent knowledge. So this argument was a revelation to me. It straight up solved my materialist crisis. And I shared it in as many places as I could. I told my friends about it. I told my family about it, from all across the ideological spectrum, from all sorts of backgrounds of faith beliefs. And it made me very popular at dinner parties, you can believe. It worked. This argument was really convincing to people. But the biggest question I kept getting asked was, okay, so what? And this is where we come to the problem. Even if people acknowledge that transcendency is possible, that transcendent knowledge is possible, and that there's something to our reality other than the physical things we can hold, that doesn't answer the question of why we ought to pursue that knowledge. And for people with a strong religious background, they weren't so much concerned with this question. For them, the why is really easy. The divine is already conceived of as beautiful, true, good. Of course, we should pursue this area of knowledge. Of course, we should seek to understand. But for people who were non-religious, or on the further end of that spectrum, people who were actively anti-religious, that wasn't so much true. These are people who have a distaste for religion for many different reasons. Some of them are personal negative experiences with organized religion. Some of them are just plagued by the problem of evil, which I'm sure all of us have thought about many times. So to put the problem very simply, lots of people don't like God. Lots of people don't think that the transcendent is beautiful or good or true. how can we get these people on board with the study of metaphysics anyway? Presumably, they have things to contribute to the field. Presumably, they're just as capable of transcendent knowledge as anyone else. But if we can't talk them out of this particular perspective, are there ways that we can convince them that transcendent knowledge is worth pursuing without convincing them that it is worth pursuing in and of itself? All right, so quick little side note. I'm specifically limiting this conversation to people who are non-religious or anti-religious. So these aren't people who are materialist or atheist. These aren't people who deny a possibility of transcendency or divinity. That's a whole nother question that I would love to hear your thoughts on in the Q&A, but that's just not what I'm trying to deal with here because I don't think it fits. I don't think it's quite the same problem. So I call this problem the Lovecraft problem, phrased as how can we convince non or anti-religious people that metaphysics is worthwhile? And I call this the Lovecraft problem for two reasons. The first is that Lovecraftian themes are highly influential in popular culture, especially in the United States. They're just everywhere. Second, Lovecraftian themes represent the absolute epitome of anti and non-religious thought. It can be a sort of criterion for us. If we can vocalize a Lovecraftian worldview and find reasons for metaphysics within that worldview, then everything that's lesser than this extremity should also work for those same arguments. So, quick side note, who was H.P. Lovecraft? Virulent racist. I feel like it's important for me to acknowledge that, and also a diehard atheist. In the upper right, there's a picture of Mr. Lovecraft with his cat, who he named a racial slur. He was a writer of pulp fiction magazines. These are the sort of cheap dime magazines of science fiction stories that you could get everywhere in the beginning of the 20th century. And he was a major influencer of a subgenre of horror called cosmic horror. This is a genre defined by malevolent or ambivalent visions of the divine that are vastly outside of human comprehension, so much so that trying to comprehend can even lead to madness, or visions of the divine that think of humans as irrelevant insects or give no thoughts to humans whatsoever. His most famous character is Cthulhu, which you can see in the bottom right. This is one of his great old ones, a sort of evil, creeping divine being that defies human logic and defies attempts of humanity to connect with it. So let's go to reason one. Lovecraft is absolutely everywhere. If you've ever been to a comic book convention, you can't take 3 steps without running into something inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. This is just a small selection of the things that he's directly inspired. It spans video games, movies, books, board games, even little cute plushies like this cute little Cthulhu right here. So we're steeped in Lovecraft in all of the media that we consume, especially in the United States. And second, Lovecraftian thought is the absolute epitome of non or anti-religious thought. As the quotes above sort of illustrate, it's a vision of divinity as evil or cruel, or recognizing humans as unimportant in and of themselves. It's, in my opinion, the most terrifying genre of horror, because while most horror deals with things that are physical threats to our lives, giant sharks, guys with stabby knives, those sorts of things, the cosmic horror asserts that it doesn't matter if we live or die, that our lives are irrelevant in the first place. And that is a terrifying thought. So Professor David Pinnall, who's a professor of religious studies at Santa Clara, phrases Lovecraft, the sort of Lovecraftian mode of thought as the most modern incarnation of Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is a controversial term. I've read all sorts of different definitions, but the one that he goes with is a sort of anti-Christian ideology that was defined by the idea that our earth is radically evil and characterized by suffering. I think he's very vivid when he says, Gnostics laughed to scorn the idea of a loving creator God. Pinnall argues that Lovecraft's version of Gnosticism that came through in his fiction was sparked by a crisis of modernity, an overhaul of his Rhode Island home that changed dramatically at the turn of the 20th century, going from a sort of idyllic rural life to something affected by immigration, modernization, industrialization, to the extent where he didn't recognize his childhood home anymore. These themes are always present in his work. They always have to do with mysterious evils hidden under the humble guise of New England towns. So now we have this idea of what Lovecraftianism is. It's this modern incarnation of Gnosticism. It's the modern temptation to reject the nature of the divine as something good, and instead to think of it as something tied to suffering or to ambivalence. But now that we have this criterion set out, what are the solutions that we can use? For people who see the world in this way, how is there any way that we can convince them that metaphysics is something worthwhile? Two solutions. First, we're going to start with Camus. Camus has this idea of metaphysical rebellion. And so I put the rebels there from Star Wars that we all know and love. But unlike the rebels from Star Wars who have something to shoot at, metaphysical rebels have nothing to shoot at. They're rebelling against existence itself. This idea originated from Camus during World War II, as he saw his home of France be devastated by countless cruelty and loss of life. Rather than sort of blame this on sort of human error, he looked around him and saw that human beings were being denied the things that he thought we rightfully deserved as beings in the world. A chance at happiness, a chance at dignity, a chance at freedom. And that at the end of the day, we are all locked into this permanent death sentence by the universe and the reality in which we live, that to him was vastly unfair. So throughout his work, he uses the metaphor of a slave rebelling against his master. Even if the slave has no pathway out of his relationship of ownership with his master, even if there's no physical way for him to escape the situation, Camus asserts that there is value in the very practice of him rejecting it, of him refusing to accept the unfair circumstances in which he finds himself. And he argues that we can do something similar, that there is value in us rejecting the unfairness that reality has placed upon us, rejecting the death sentence to which we are all destined. He phrased this as an explicitly anti-religious endeavor. He called us the metaphysical rebel is inevitably a blasphemer. And in this way, the metaphysical rebellion fits really well with the Lovecraftian framework. Being a metaphysical rebel is sort of a natural response to a vision of the universe that is ambivalent or cruel. But that doesn't quite get us to metaphysics, not yet. I'll take a quick side note here on this movie called Cube. Came out in 1997, and it is not a good movie. I'm going to spoil it for you to save you from watching it. It's not great, it's gross. Let's just avoid it entirely. But it does illustrate the point. In Cube, 5 characters wake up to find themselves stuck in a cube. They have no idea why they're there, how they got there, who made the cube, with what purpose, or anything about their situation. And they don't even know if there's any way to escape. Over the course of the movie, they start to sort of unravel the metaphysics behind their new reality. They start to understand the rules that this universe, this new universe of the cube, is dictated by. The things that it are consistent about it, the things that are inconsistent about it. Over the course of the movie, the majority of the characters in their rebellion against the cube, in their attempt to escape, go mad, die horrible deaths, or otherwise meet their untimely ends. But through the study of the metaphysics of their new reality, through understanding the reality around them, eventually escape becomes possible. And at the end of the movie, a single human is able to escape and walks out into a blinding light. The metaphor of the movie Cube illustrates perfectly how we can get from metaphysical rebellion to, under a Lovecraftian framework, to justifying metaphysics as a practice for these people. We can answer to Camus' metaphysical rebel, you don't actually have to be helpless. Perhaps there's a way out, but you won't know if you don't attempt to understand. Put simply, this is a sort of know your enemy. To the people who seek to rebel against their very existence, we can simply tell them, come with us, collaborate. We're already trying to understand the nature of our reality, the nature of divinity. If you help us out, maybe you'll find something that can help you out in your struggle. Maybe you'll better understand the situation that you're in, and that will help you in this inherently valuable internal struggle that you are undergoing. What's great about this answer is it works well under a Lovecraftian framework, but it also works really well for people who are really on the fence, who don't know what they think about divinity. Because metaphysics works either way. If the divine is in fact good, and that's what they believe, then of course we should pursue metaphysics. Of course we should seek to understand. But if the divine isn't good, and that's what they end up believing, then we should still pursue metaphysics. Then it is still a worthwhile endeavor to understand the thing that they are trying to reject. So let's go to our second possible approach here from Walsh, Priority of the Person, an essay that we read for our class here. This, I think, is actually the much better approach for the reasons I'll get into in a second. So Ronner and Lovecraft, the sort of perspectives on the universe that we've talked about so far, have a sort of metaphysics where they look outward. They look outwards towards reality, and they're like, what is going on? Let's understand all this. But Walsh's paper looks inward. It looks inward to our nature as beings in the physical world. It talks about our nature as persons rather than trying to dissect the divine as a whole. Now, there's a ton of overlap here, obviously, right? No one takes one of these approaches to the exclusion of the other. But I do think they represent two distinct approaches when we're trying to approach someone with certain beliefs who may not have really encountered much metaphysics before, just as I hadn't when I'd first come to this fellowship. So what is Walsh's approach? Well, Walsh argues that transcendence is what marks the person. And he gives a lot of really clear observable evidence for this. The most powerful one to me was cave paintings, that he shows that these early humans, surrounded by threats to their life on all sides, disease, infection, saber-toothed cats, still found the will to make beautiful pieces of art that had nothing to do with their survival, and that lasted thousands of years and have touched millions of people. This sort of shows that humans are more than the mere will to survive that sends to defy another life. And he points out that humans sacrifice their lives for each other all the time. There's even such a thing as post-mortem acts of kindness that obviously can't benefit us in any way, such as organ donation. And he takes this to mean that the person carries existence far more lightly than anything else than our reality does, much more than any of our sort of physical objects that sort of stubbornly exist and don't do much else, much more than other forms of life that cling to existence up to their last breath without these sort of same sense of self-sacrifice. And he also pointed out that this transcendence is a sort of thing that's shared. It's an awareness that is shared with the world around us. The example that he provides is language. When Helen Keller realized that water means water, means this liquid that she was feeling, what she was really realizing was our shared understanding and our shared experience of this liquidy thing that we all have to drink. And that the word water and language as a whole is just our way of communicating this shared understanding. So Walsh gives voice to the transcendent experience of being a person in a world shared by other persons. And this, in my opinion, is a really, really strong approach, especially when we're talking about a Lovecraftian worldview, because transcendence in Walsh's paper is something that we can't deny, because it's something that we all experience on a daily basis. When we watch a movie with a friend, we experience the joy of shared awareness of the same physical part of the world. When we encounter art, when we even encounter functional objects that are embellished in ways that don't serve their immediate function. Pictionary and charades are gamifications of shared awareness. We seek to create shared awareness within the others as the objective of the game. So this transcendence of the person and this priority of the person is something that we can't really deny. And what's important about that is that it works really well under a Lovecraftian framework, because it means that we do not need to agree on what the nature of the divine. We don't even need to know the nature of the divine. We don't have to have our minds made up. As long as a person is existing with the subjective transcendent experience of being a person, they already have the baseline through which they can practice metaphysics and start thinking about what transcendency means. This, while Camus' metaphysical rebel in cooperating in the process and field of metaphysics with perhaps a theologian, they're going to run into a lot of disagreements. They're going to run into a lot of arguments. But not so if we're looking inwards towards the person. Everyone has these same sort of experience that everyone can relate to. And so we don't need to agree on the divine. We don't need to agree on its nature. We don't need to agree on anything other than to know the experience of being a person sharing the world with other people. And that's why I think this is a much stronger approach. I think it not only invites non-religious or anti-religious people into metaphysics, but it also gives us a baseline with which to cooperate in thought with them. Now, Walsh, I think, actually gets a really big bonus point under a Lovecraftian framework. Recall that cosmic horror, that's the sort of defining feature of Lovecraft's fiction, is the horror of our own insignificance in the face of an ambivalent universe. And Walsh argues against this really, really powerfully. He argues that persons are unique and uniquely irreplaceable. We are each like an astonishing Big Bang. We each have these rich inner realities that can never be replaced and can never be replicated. And because of this uniqueness, we have priority over all else in the universe. This too is something that we can't deny because it's something that we experience individually on a daily basis. And it was also something that spoke powerfully to me from a Jewish background, where a frequent sort of Jewish ethical principle is of this inner reality. If you destroy one life, it is as if you destroyed an entire world, because you've destroyed the inner world that existed within this person's head. So in this way, It doesn't matter if the divine thinks of us as ants. It doesn't matter if you have a Lovecraftian way of looking at the world. It is self-evident that we are not irrelevant and that we are instead transcendent beings with rich and unique universes inside our heads. This isn't necessary to convince these people to practice metaphysics, but I think that it's a huge bonus point because it's hugely reassuring for people who are skeptical about the nature of the divine. So that's my presentation. I attempted to answer the question, how do we convince non-religious or anti-religious people to engage with metaphysics? And I called this the Lovecraft Problem for the reasons that I outlined before. And I came up with two possible answers. First, Camus' metaphysical rebellion, which we can sum up as saying, know your enemy. And the second, Walsh's priority of the person, which we can sum up as know each other. And between these two, I think that Walsh's approach has the advantage because it is universal and builds off of the transcendent experience that we all have just by nature of being beings in the world. So that's what I've got for you. Please feel free to, I welcome any questions that you have. I would also love to hear more of your thoughts. If you have any additional strategies for this problem, or if you have strategies on how to invite people who may be atheists or materialist into the field of metaphysics. Might sound like a contradiction. I don't know. I didn't tackle it, but I would love to hear all of your thoughts on all of this. So thank you.